Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at research methods and ethics in neuroscience. You sent over some really interesting sources, and I got to say I'm already fascinated.
It's such a dynamic field, constantly pushing the boundaries of what we know about the brain and how we study it.
You're right, and it's not just about the science itself. It's also about, the responsibility that comes with exploring the very essence of what makes us human.
Couldn't agree more. So where should we start?
Well, one thing that really caught my eye was this whole nature versus nurture thing, How much of who we are is kind of predetermined by our genes, and how much is shaped by our experiences. You've included some studies on heritability.
Yeah, heritability studies are really fundamental to behavioral genetics. They offer a window into how much variation in a trait like intelligence or even personality can be traced back to our genes.
And the sources mentioned twin studies. It's a key method here. It's just amazing how researchers can separate the influence of genes and environment by comparing identical twins who share 100% of their genes to fraternal twins who share only 50%.
Think of it this way. We have two sets of twins, and we give each of them the same cake recipe. The identical twins, their cakes turn out pretty much the same. But the fraternal twins end up with totally different results. This kind of suggests that baking skills are highly heritable. It's the same concept researchers use to study human traits.
Okay, yeah, that analogy, that makes it so much clearer. So a high heritability estimate for a trait means a stronger genetic influence. One of the sources said that the heritability of intelligence is estimated to be around 50%. So that means that about half the variation we see in intelligence among people can be linked back to genes.
Exactly. But it's really important to keep in mind that heritability doesn't equal destiny. Just because a trait has high heritability, like intelligence, doesn't mean your IQ is fixed. It just means that genes play a significant role in the variation we observe in intelligence across different individuals.
Right, it's not a guarantee, it's more like a nudge in a certain direction. The environment still plays a huge role. I noticed that schizophrenia has an even higher heritability, like somewhere between 60% to 90%. So does that mean genes are even more influential in that case?
It suggests that there's a stronger genetic influence when it comes to schizophrenia, yes. But again, it's not the only factor. Things in the environment, like stress or early childhood experiences, can also play a big part.
So it's really this intricate interplay between genes and environment. Kind of a complex dance where both partners take turns leading and following.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And this dance isn't just happening at a large scale, across entire populations. It's also happening within each of us at the level of our genes.
What you're talking about epigenetics, right? I saw that mentioned in one of the sources. It's the idea that things in our environments can actually change, how our genes are expressed, even though the DNA sequence itself doesn't change.
Exactly. Imagine this. You have a cookbook filled with recipes. Those recipes represent your genes. But how the final dish turns out, the way those genes are expressed, that depends on the ingredients you use, which is like your environment, and how you cook them, which represents your lifestyle choices.
Wow, so it's not just about the genes we inherit, it's about how those genes are turned on or off by our experiences. That's amazing.
And it has really significant implications for our understanding of both physical and mental health, how they develop.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. But how do researchers actually study these complex interactions that happen in the brain? I see you've got information here about brain imaging techniques.
Brain imaging has completely changed how we understand the brain. It allows us to look inside the mind and see which areas become active during different tasks or emotional states. It's like having a window into the symphony of neural activity happening inside our heads.
And there's so many different techniques, each with its own strengths and limitations. We have PET scans, fMRI, EEG. It's like an entire toolkit for exploring the brain.
You got it. Each tool provides a unique piece of the puzzle, helping us to build a more complete picture of how the brain functions.
So PET scans can track how glucose is used in the brain, showing us which areas are metabolically active during specific tasks. It's like watching the brain's fuel gauge in action.
Right, and fMRI takes us a step further. Beyond static images, imagine seeing blood flow to specific brain regions as someone's trying to solve a difficult math problem. fMRI lets us witness that neural activity in real time.
I read that fMRI was actually really important in discovering a brain region called the fusiform face area, which seems to be specialized for recognizing faces.
That's right. Researchers observed that this specific area consistently became active when people looked at pictures of faces, which provided strong evidence for its role in face recognition.
That's incredible. But it's not all about high-tech imaging, right? The sources also mention lesion studies and TMS. It seems like these methods take a different approach to understanding how the brain works.
Yes, they offer valuable insights by disrupting brain activity, either through studying people who have existing brain lesions, or by temporarily and non-invasively interfering with brain activity using TMS. It's kind of like carefully disconnecting different parts of a complex machine to understand how each component contributes to its overall function. Yeah, it's a really fascinating approach. By observing what happens when a specific part of the brain is damaged, we can start to figure out what that area does. It's like trying to figure out how a clock works by taking out one of the gears and seeing what stops ticking.
And in the sources, you've included the classic case of Phineas Gage. His personality completely changed after he had that accident where a rod went through his frontal lobe, which really highlights how important that area is for things like personality and social behavior.
Oh, Phineas Gage is like a landmark case in neuropsychology, a really powerful illustration of how damage to a specific area of the brain can cause particular changes in behavior.
But you mentioned before that interpreting these lesion studies can be tricky.
Right. Yeah, it can be tricky because the brain is so interconnected. It's like a network. So damage to one area can have these ripple effects. And that can make it hard to really pinpoint the exact function of the area that was damaged.
So it's like a domino effect. One domino falls and it can set off a whole chain reaction.
Exactly. That's a great way to think about it. It really shows just how complex the brain is.
And so where does TNS fit into all of this? It sounds like a less invasive way to disrupt brain activity.
Exactly. TMS uses these magnetic pulses to temporarily interfere with the activity of a specific brain region. So you can think of it kind of like a virtual lesion, a temporary disruption that lets us study the effects of inhibiting that area without causing any permanent damage.
So it's like pressing the pause button on a specific part of the brain, just for a little while. And the sources say that it's used to study all sorts of things like language processing and motor control.
That's right. TMS has become a really valuable tool in cognitive neuroscience. It lets researchers investigate the role of different brain regions in all sorts of cognitive processes.
It's amazing how far research methods have come. But as we're learning more and more about the brain, we also need to be really careful about the ethical implications, right?
Oh, absolutely. Ethics are fundamental to any research that involves humans or animals. We've definitely come a long way from some of the practices of the past. But it's a conversation that needs to continue as new technologies emerge and our understanding of the brain grows.
You've included information here about informed consent. It seems pretty obvious now that people participating in research should totally understand what a study involves before they agree to participate. But I guess it wasn't always like that.
No, unfortunately it wasn't. There have been some really unethical studies in the past where people were basically experimented on without knowing or consenting. The Tuskegee syphilis study is a really disturbing example.
That's just awful. It's a stark reminder of why we need these ethical guidelines. It's about protecting the well-being of research participants and their right to make their own choices.
Informed consent is absolutely essential in ethical research today. It's about respecting a person's right to make informed decisions about whether or not to participate in a study. And that means knowing all the potential risks and benefits.
And it's not just about physical risks. There can be emotional and psychological risks, too, especially when we're dealing with sensitive issues like mental health or memory.
That's a really important point. Researchers have a responsibility to think carefully about all the possible risks and to do everything they can to minimize any potential harm.
And of course, the sources also talk about the ethics of animal research, which I know is a topic that generates a lot of discussion.
Yeah, animal research has played a huge role in many scientific discoveries, from developing vaccines to understanding the brain, but it's absolutely essential that we make sure we're doing everything we can to minimize harm and that we're following strict ethical guidelines.
The sources mention the case of Edward Taub. His research on monkeys was really controversial at the time, but it ultimately led to new rehabilitation techniques for people who have brain injuries.
Yeah, Taub's case is a good example of just how complex the issue of animal research can be. His methods were criticized a lot at first, but his work did lead to some really important benefits for people. It raises some really difficult questions about how we balance the potential benefits of research with the ethical responsibility to avoid causing harm to animals.
It's a really tough balance to find. And it seems like these ethical considerations are only going to become even more complex as technology continues to advance.
Absolutely. We're living in a time of incredible technological progress. We have brain-computer interfaces, gene editing. All these advancements have so much potential, but they also bring up some really profound ethical questions.
One of the sources mentioned gene editing, specifically CRISPR. It's mind-blowing to think that we can now actually modify DNA sequences.
Oh, CRISPR has completely revolutionized the field of genetic research. It's opened up the possibility of curing genetic diseases. But it also raises some really important concerns about designer babies, unintended consequences, the potential for genetic discrimination, all kinds of things.
It's almost like we're holding the blueprint of life in our hands, and we have a scalpel. We have to be so careful and have open and honest discussions about the ethical implications.
I couldn't agree more. It's not just about the science itself, it's about how these technology will impact society.
It's a lot to think about, but that's part of what makes this field so fascinating. It's not just about figuring out the mysteries of the brain. It's also about wrestling with these really profound ethical questions that come with this increasing knowledge.
It's a journey of discovery on both a scientific and an ethical level. And as we continue to explore the brain, we have to do it with a sense of responsibility and a commitment to using our knowledge for good, for the benefit of humanity.
Wow, it feels like we've just dipped our toes into this whole world of research methods and ethics.
We really have. And with technology advancing so quickly, I think these ethical questions are only going to get more and more complicated.
Yeah, it's like every time we learn something new about the brain, it opens up a whole new set of ethical challenges. It's this constant balancing act between pushing the limits of what we know and making sure we're using that knowledge responsibly.
And that responsibility goes way beyond just the lab, you know? It's about having these open and honest conversations with the public, about the potential benefits and risks of all these advancements. It's about making sure everyone has equal access to new technologies and protecting against the possibility of misuse.
It's about creating a future where scientific progress and ethical progress go hand in hand. It's not just about what we can do, it's about what we should do.
Absolutely. Science is a powerful tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad. It's up to us to make sure that our pursuit of knowledge is guided by strong ethical principles.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. We've covered so much, from heritability and epigenetics to brain imaging, TMS, and even gene editing. It's clear that neuroscience is moving forward at an incredible pace, and the ethical implications are only going to become more important as we go.
It's a really exciting time to be in this field, but it's also a time for us to really think carefully and have these important conversations. We need to approach these advancements with a sense of humility, knowing that we don't have all the answers, and recognizing that the choices we make today are going to shape the future of neuroscience and how it impacts humanity.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something for you to think about. If scientists were able to develop a technology that allowed you to experience someone else's memories, like they were your own, would you try it? What ethical considerations would you want to be in place before such a technology was made available? Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.